Hi, and welcome to Studio SN. My name is Sara Naumann, and today we're going to play with a double heat embossing technique featuring WOW Embossing Powders. The front of my card features this double embossing technique, which is so much fun. And you can see on here the yellow, this is one layer of embossing powder that's been heat set, melted. And then the purple on here is a second layer of embossing powder that has been stamped and also heat set. Such an easy technique to do, and it really does give you a lot of really neat texture and then also some shine on here. And the stamp I'm using gives a really beautiful vintage effect. So the embossing powders that I'm using, I mentioned that I'm working with WOW Embossing Powders, and I'm using the fluorescent yellow regular and primary purple orchid regular. And by regular, it simply means in contrast to something like a super fine. It's the consistency of the embossing powder. So fluorescent yellow and primary purple, maybe you wouldn't think to put the two of them together for a vintage effect, but it does work, and such an easy technique too. So let me show you how I've done this. I'm starting with a piece of scrap paper to do my embossing with, and then I'm also going to use a piece of glossy white cardstock for this. I really like glossy cardstock for embossing. It just has a nice weight to it, and it already has a nice sheen to it as well. So I'm starting with my glossy cardstock, and then I'll also use the fluorescent yellow. And I need to have an embossing ink pad or a watermark stamp pad, and I'm using Versamark. And so what I'll do is simply turn this over and squash the embossing ink directly onto my glossy cardstock. And I need to cover the piece completely, so I'm kind of trying to hold down corners of it without getting a big thumbprint on there as well. So I'll try and do the best I can here. It sticks a little bit to that embossing ink pad. So once I've got that all covered, then what I'm going to do is just open up my scrap paper here so I have kind of a funnel. And then I'm going to sprinkle my fluorescent yellow all over the background. You can, of course, dump the entire pot of embossing powder on here because nothing goes to waste. You're going to funnel it right back into any excess right back into the jar. So just go back and forth, make sure it's all covered on there, and I have a very bright yellow piece of cardstock. So then the next thing I can do, I'll kind of set that aside, get my empty pot here, and then use my scrap paper as a funnel just to get that back into the pot so that nothing goes to waste, but I make sure I have a lot of nice coverage on there. So then the next thing I need to do with this is heat set it. And if you've done heat embossing before, you know, you just take your heat gun or your heating tool and then hold it a couple of inches away at an angle and then wait until the entire thing melts from the heat of that. And when you do, you will have a piece that looks like this. I'm not going to do the heat embossing on camera because I'm a bit limited to where I can plug things in with all of the other equipment that I've got and the microphone and so on. A couple of things though to keep in mind as you're aiming your embossing gun over this and you're watching that heat melt the embossing powder, you do need to hold it for a couple of minutes. It does take longer because it's a bigger surface than, say, a stamped flower or something, for example. So you're covering a whole surface here, and this is about 4 inches square, this piece of cardstock. After you have it entirely heat set, do let it cool down for a minute or two because it is, you know, it's all over and it's hot and there's not really a place where you can pick it up without putting your thumb into wet melting embossing powder. So you want to give it just a minute to let it dry. After it is dry and you have this really cool shiny piece on here, then you can come back and do your stamping. So I'm using a great big background stamp. This is also from WOW, and this is their brocade. So this is the design here. It's a clear acrylic stamp. Once again, I'm going to ink it up with my Versamark. So just go ahead and ink this up. Make sure that I get some nice coverage on here as well. And then I'm simply going to stamp it directly onto my heat embossed piece. Normally with a big background stamp like this, I would stand, but for this I have to sit down. So I'm trying to get as much leverage on here as possible. Sometimes it's nice to take a book or something big and flat that you can get a little bit more even pressure. So pull this off, and then I'm going to come back with my purple embossing powder, and I'm simply going to put this on top. Again, use a liberal application because you can always reuse the rest of that. And I can see where I didn't quite get that design stamped on there, but that's okay. If I have any excess bits, I can just rub them off. And then I would just go ahead and heat set this as well. So let me set this aside. Let me set my embossing piece aside, and I can also show you right here. This is what it would look like when it is all done and heat embossed. So you've got a really pretty shiny effect, and then you've got the detail of that stamping as well, which is also really cool. So I'm going to bring back in my original card and show you what I've done with this. So I simply trimmed it down to fit onto the front of my card. I inked around the outside edges with a black ink pad just to help it stand out a little bit more. I think I also made a mistake on this one. I didn't get a perfect impression, so I've got a nice great big flower on there that can really hide any impressions that didn't come out quite perfectly. So I've got some twine wrapped around here, also some grosgrain ribbon. The Always and Forever down here, this is another WOW stamp set, and then this is the Express Yourself. So I've got the Always and Forever and that little ampersand on there as well. And that's just stamped in black down at the bottom. This piece has been raised up on foam tape because I've got this twine wrapped around there, and it does add a little bit of bulk to it as well. So this is how you can do a double embossing technique very easily, and a beautiful tactile effect as well. I hope you enjoyed today's show. For more ideas and inspiration, please do stop by my website at saranaumann.com. Thank you for joining me on Studio SN, and I will see you again next time.